All right, guys, this is Dr. Bernard. This is our first recorded video. For our second lecture, today we're going to talk about science and the environment. This is also a lecture that corresponds with Chapter 1 of your e-textbook. So last time in class, we talked about human ecology, what the class is all about, and we learned that there's 4 important global trends today. We were discussed human population and well-being, and then we discussed the status of vital ecosystem services. We talked about global climate change, and we talked about the loss of biodiversity today. And we know that to address those problems, we need to be more aware of sustainability, our relationship with the natural world. We know that we need sound science to help us understand how the world works and how we interact with it. And then we need to be steward of our planet. We need to manage our natural resources for the next generation. So what are we talking when we talk about well-being of humans? In order to quantify what well-being is, we look at 3 different things which help us calculate some kind of index. So the things that we are looking at are health, education, and basic living standards. So those measurements have been conducted from the early 1970s up to today. And today, out of the 135 countries that have been surveyed, we know that well-being in humans has increased, and we can quantify that through higher life expectancy, education, and incomes. So these results are showing us that for at least the past 40 to 50 years, well-being in humans is increasing. However, not all countries are seeing the well-being increasing. So in 2000, all the members of the United Nations came together for the Millennium Development Goals. The goal, back then in 2000, was to reduce extreme poverty by 2015. This involved several goals. Some of them were met ahead of schedule and some were actually not attainable yet. So what do we need to attain those goals? We need to make sure that our ecosystems continues to produce goods. Ecosystems support human life and economies, providing us with several services. If they are not very well managed, we are likely to deplete our groundwater, degrade our soils, overfish, and cut our forests too fast before they have time to regenerate. We know that today's world economics rely on those goods that are provided by our ecosystem. Water, food, fuels, wood, leather, and so on, as well as raw material for fabrics, oil, and alcohol. So the ecosystem provides many services that we rely on. They break down the waste, they regulate climate, they prevent erosions, they help us manage our pH. And then they also maintain the nutrient cycles that are needed to grow plants and crops. So those goods and services are definitely the base of our ecosystems. They are what we call ecosystem capitals. We need them for our well-being and our economic development. We need to protect those services and those goods. This is what really defines a nation's wealth. So humans consume those goods and use those services pretty much every day. We need food, we need water, we need shelter. All of that is coming from our ecosystem around us. However, our consumption is very unequal from one country to another. Some people use a lot more and others have access to a lot less. If we were to look at the resource that an average American consumes every day, if everybody on Earth was to produce and consume as much as we do, we will need the resource for more than 4th Earth in order to provide everything that's needed. In 2001, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, an initiative that started in 2001 and lasted until the end of 2005, looked at the world ecosystem. Over 1,360 scientists from 95 countries gathered information, that means conducted research, on ecosystem in the world. They focus on the links between ecosystem services and human well-being. So more specifically, they were looking at the services that were produced by those ecosystems or that were provided by those ecosystems. So what we call the provisioning services, for example, how much we were getting for our food and fuel. They look at the regulating services, for example, protection against floods, erosion, things like that. And then they look at the cultural services. Many of the services that we have that are related to our culture, the way we do things, are related to the ecosystem around us. And then they focus on those 3 services. Those are the 3 main ones that humans use. So what this assessment found is that most of our ecosystem are actually degraded and overexploited. And it's something that is very widespread. Over 60% of the ecosystem goods and services that are being degraded are used unsustainably today on Earth. If this doesn't stop, there is likely to be very deadly consequence for us. Other assessments conducted after 2005 found similar trends. However, one set of providing services has been enhanced. Food production has actually kept up with population growth. So we are doing that, good for that. But for anything such as managing groundwater, our soils, our fish, our forests, etc., we are not doing that great. One of the main consequences of this degradation is climate change. And then when we really look at the reason behind climate change, we know that the amount of carbon dioxide that we release is too high today in the atmosphere. Each day, we burn about 93.3 billion barrels of oil, 324 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and about 11.6 million tons of coal per day. That releases a lot of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is not necessarily something that is really bad. It's actually required for plants, by the plants to do photosynthesis. However, it is also involved with the Earth's atmosphere energy system. And when we have too much carbon dioxide, we are actually dealing with the greenhouse effect. So you guys probably remember from your high school class that the greenhouse effect the carbon dioxide absorbs infrared energy and keeps it trapped in the atmosphere. Over time, this trapped energy becomes excessive and the Earth warms up. So scientists have been measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we know that for the past 50, 60 years now, the concentration of carbon atmosphere is increasing. And scientists using different models have been able to also measure global temperature. We know that the increase since the late 19th centuries, since we started measuring and recording temperature of the oceans. And we know that over time, we have a trend with a gradual increase in the temperature of the oceans. And that is also true for the lands. So we know that there is some issue with climate change and global warming. So in 1988, we had establishment of an intergovernmental panel by the United Nations. This panel meets every 5 years, and it's getting its inputs from thousands of experts, thousands of scientists, and also civilians. So people involved with all kind of different aspects that are impacted by climate change in societies in many countries. And then this panel produce convincing evidence, and every 5 years they reassess those evidence that human-induced climate change is severely affecting global climate. And then those panels concluded that future change could be catastrophic if emission of greenhouse gas are not controlled. So without a few exceptions, that would be, for example, volcanic activities, there is a clear consensus that climate change is a huge global warming problem and it's caused by humans, and we must reduce our carbon dioxide emission. And then the panel also established that the poorest countries are likely to be the ones who are going to be hit the hardest with the effect of climate change, because they depend on their natural ecosystem a lot more than countries that are more advanced. So how do we know that humans are responsible for that? Well, environmental science is the science that observes how environments are changing, and we know that human societies live in the natural world. We simply change the natural world. We convert the material that we find to build our own environments. We change the ecosystem into agricultural ones, and we also dump our waste directly into those ecosystems. So the environment is anything that includes the natural world and also the human societies and the human built world. Why do we need to care about biodiversity? Once a species is gone, it is gone forever. It's not going to come back. The species that we see today, the living form that we see today, are the result of millions of years of evolution. Once it's gone forever when we lose one. Our biodiversity is also very important for agricultural crops. A lot of our pests are actually controlled naturally, and also for us when we want to develop medicines, when we need to find new molecules. Natural ecosystems help us maintain our land. For example, they reduce erosions, they prevent erosions, they provide us with fresh water. We need to enable them to recover after a disturbance. And again, climate change is affecting with a greater impact the poorest countries. So environmental science is a field of science that helps us understand and study and understand how the world really works. So today we know that we need to decrease the impact of our actions. We need to find better and alternate and better ways to do things, and we need to anticipate the effect of our actions. So in order to do that, we need to look at our own history, how what we started doing has impacted the world, the natural world. For example, when we talk about history, we want to look at the world before the Industrial Revolution, and we want to look at how is that changed after the Industrial Revolutions. Engineering is a field of science, or is the disciplines that will help us develop better and alternate ways to do what we need to do. Geology, physics, biology, and even medicines are the field of science that will help us understand how the natural world works. And sociology is the field of science that will help us understand how human societies are built. Why do we do what we do? What are we facing in different parts of the world that we need to do the activities that we do? So environmental science is probably one of the most multidisciplinary science that you can work in. So why do we need to look at the past? Why do we need to understand our own history to understand how the world works today? So the US environmental movement is something that started about 60 years ago, and it is rooted in the late 19th centuries. People started to realize back then that very unique and natural wild areas were starting to disappear. So scientists started to really study what was going on there, and then they established the grassroots actions that really help develop policies to protect those resources and ultimately us as people. So you had formation of multiple groups that were starting to develop policies, guidelines to protect natural ecosystem. So why do we need to look at our own history? For example, we know that the Dust Bowl in the early 1930s was created by unwise agricultural practices in the 19th century. During the Great Depression, conservationists provided the first environmental protection and also new jobs. And then following World War II, we really saw a development of new technologies. However, with those new technologies and this new industrialization area, we also observed that polluted air started to affect our rivers, our beaches, and so we started to see a decline in species. So today, we are still protecting our environment. We still see the modern environmental movement. It's something that is highly supported by many citizens here. People want to see decreased pollution. They want to clean up polluted area. They want some areas that are still pristine, that means that have not been affected by any sort of pollution, to be protected. In 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, and then this agency has passed many laws to control pollution and protects our wildlife here in the US. However, EPA has not been able to resolve all of the issues that we see in our environment. There are many problems that still need to be resolved, to be solved. So today we know that in order to get a better future, we need to develop better and more sustainable technology. We need to become steward. That means we need to protect our planet today for our next generation. And in order to do that, we need science, and we need sound science. So sustainability is defined for a system if it can continue indefinitely. That means that the material that it's made of is not depleted and the energy that it needs is being provided. So what kind of system do we have in the natural world that could be sustainable? For example, our forests and our fisheries are sustainable or are potentially sustainable systems. We can harvest some of those resources. We can cut wood and harvest that wood, and we can we can fish. But if we stay under a certain threshold, the population can replace itself. This also applies to fresh water, to soil, even pollution absorption. Ecosystems that we know are sustainable are natural systems that can thrive over time. They recycle their own nutrients. They maintain a good diversity of species, and then they use the sun as a source of energy. So society can be sustainable. A sustainable society is defined as a society that could continue for generations without depleting the resource in the environment, and would also not produce more pollution than what nature can actually absorb and eliminate. However, in many instances, our interaction with nature are not sustainable, and we know that as a result, we observe declining biodiversity, we observe degradation or disruption of our ecosystem. We know that we release too many greenhouse gases, for example, carbon dioxide. We know that in developing countries, the population continue to grow, and that increase in population will also later on increase the need for energy and resource use. So we know we need to put in place sustainable solution. What does this mean? We need to continue to develop in a way that is going to meet our current need, while also avoiding compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We need to continue to improve human well-being, especially in developing countries, and we need to be more concerned about integrating environmental sustainability in our own economic development. What does this mean? It means that we need to incorporate equity. That means we need to meet our own needs without compromising the ones of our future generation. So sustainability means a lot of different things depending on who you talk to. For example, for economists are concerned about growth, efficiency of resource use, economy, while sociologists focus more on human needs. They want to make sure that you have empowerment, you have social cohesion, you have cultural identity that is being preserved. And ecologists want to save natural systems. They want to protect life on Earth. They want to protect the carrying capacity of Earth, and they want to reduce pollutions. So how can we reach those goals, and how can we address all those concerns? Well, in order to be able to address those concerns and to reach our goal, we need sound science. You guys probably already know that many environmental issues are sometimes controversial or leave people very, very confused. In order to address those controversies or this confusion, we need some reliable method to study the natural world. And this is where the scientific method comes into place. The scientific method is a way to gain knowledge. It's done in a very organized and very structured ways, and it helps us gain knowledge. Science is a legitimate in contrast with what we call junk science. Junk science is more like things that are presented as science, but really does not really rely on anything that has been rigorously collected or rigorously analyzed. Sound science is something that is produced by the scientific method, and it helps us understand how the natural world works. So the scientific method always starts with an observation of a natural phenomenon. We start with observation, and then we are going to start asking questions about this phenomenon. What is going on here? And the objective of the scientific method is to understand this phenomenon by answering that question. So the question should be something that is testable. That means you can run an experiment to try to gain new insight on this phenomenon. So through experimentation and reasoning, we can acquire new insight that will help us grow our understanding and knowledge of the natural world. So when we think about the scientific method, really what scientists are trying to develop are models. Models are based on multiple observation on the natural world, and then using the scientific method to learn or to acquire new knowledge on this particular phenomenon, and using mathematical formulas, computer simulation, diagram, description of that phenomenon. We're trying to put together something that will portray the important parts of the system. So when you think about the scientific method, you want to make sure that you understand that it's based on observation. It's based on the integration of those observation into a model. This is what scientists are working with to try to understand how that system works. And then in order to validate this model, they need to test those models. They need to ask those questions. They need to develop hypotheses, and then they need to test those hypotheses. And then using reasoning, they can explain how the phenomena works. So when scientists conduct their experiment, they're actually setting them up in a way that allows them to make systematic observations. They're trying to get a cause and an effect. For example, scientists can observe and measure how plants and animals respond to a certain specific situation. And then in order for them to validate their experiment, they need to include controls. You want to make sure you can compare what you observe to something that would not be found under other conditions. You want to make sure that you can replicate your experiments. What you're seeing, what you observe in your results can be obtained more than one time so that you can validate the experiments, typically using statistical analysis. So remember that an hypothesis is never confirmed. An hypothesis is what we call also an educated guess that can explain an observation, but it's never 100% certain. We test it through observation and experimentation, and then scientists can accept or reject the new hypothesis. The new hypothesis is when we cannot clearly establish a relationship between what we observe and what we do. So there is some form of uncertainty in science. Those are errors in measurement or understanding, and then you need to make sure that you accurately collect your data and measurements during your hypothesis, during your experiments. So science takes place within the scientific community, but the science or the outcome of the findings do not belong to the scientific community only. It actually belongs to larger society. No single authoritative source should judge the validity of a scientific explanation. You should always have competent expert in the field that you're working to help you establish if the result of your experiments and your conclusion and analysis are sound. The National Academy of Science in the US is one of the most preeminent American scientists, and they choose their peers to provide leadership in that assessment of how good your scientific discoveries are. Our third theme is stewardship. It's basically all the action and programs that manage the natural resources and human well-being for the common good. So stewards are people who care for something that they do not own, for example, the natural world or human culture, and their goal is to pass it on to the next generations. So stewardship really deals with how to achieve sustainability. What action can we take? What values do we want to follow? What are the ethical considerations? Ethics is the study of moral principle. It is really concerned with what is good and what is right. So what do we consider as being moral? What do we consider that is right? So ethical principles are usually well established for human interest. However, there are no firmly established ethics that deals with the care of natural resources. Our ethics regarding the natural world usually centers around how to use them. How are we going to use those resources to benefit or to profit from them? They don't really address any care for nature or for the creatures that live in our ecosystem. So we have very well-known stewards that we can take as example. For example, Wangari Maathai. She was an environmental activist from Kenya. She created the Green Movement, which basically aimed at combating deforestation by replanting trees and empowering women. Ramesh Agrawal, he's from India, and he was shot in the leg for his efforts to help people, demanding their right for information about some industrial projects. Stewardship is something that really involves everyday people. If you care about the natural world and each other, you are a steward. Recycling, using less polluting cars or electric cars, turning off lights in empty rooms, don't engage in any kind of consumptions, supporting environmental organization, staying informed, staying educative, all of that will help you become a steward. You can also be involved with political action if you're interested in that. Stewards are not just concerned with action that you can take. They're also concerned about justice and equity. The environmental justice movement that we described earlier in that presentation addresses environmental disparities. We know that in poor areas, even in the United States, you will find more common waste sites and other industries that pollute a lot when compared to communities that are a bit wealthier, more politically active. Those wealthier communities usually have better roads, better building, better water and sewer projects. So we have many citizen group and watchdog agencies in order to address this issue. And then one of them, for example, is Chattanooga Organized Action for Actions in Tennessee. They help poor and minority women, and they also address environmental issue in the area. So when we think about stewardship, we definitely need to think about what we can do at our local scales, but we also need to think about a more global stewardship. Globalization is what we call the interconnectedness of human activities. And so since the Industrial Revolution, globalization has increased a lot. So this has caused profound change in economies, in cultural patterns, in political relationship between countries. Overall, it has improved well-being, but it also came with an environmental cost, and that cost was a bit higher in developing countries. So today we need to rethink the way we consume goods. We need to think about where our goods are coming from and how can we do things better without disrupting economies. So here we have an example of the type of technologies that can help sustainability. World Stove is a company that produces small heating device that produce heat without any smokes. So for the people who use them, it really clears up the quality, their environment. It really improves the quality of the air that they breathe. So this concludes our presentation for our first chapter, Science and the Environment. Make sure you read the actual chapter in your e-textbook. And then when you're ready, make sure that you also complete your first homework, which is on chapter 1. This very first homework covers all the topic that we discussed today. It will show me that once you submit it, it will show me that you have mastered the important concepts that we discussed. We know that there are 4 important global trends today. We know that we are concerned with the human population growing and its well-being. We know that our vital ecosystem services are currently being disrupted and therefore challenged. Global climate is changing and it's changing fast, and we are seeing a loss and a concerning loss of the biodiversity. And we know how we can address those issues, we can address those problems. Sustainability, we need to really rethink our relationship with the natural world. We also know that we need sound science, something that we can really rely on to understand how the world works and how we can change our interaction with it. And stewardship, we should manage our natural resource and what we need for our well-being, so that we can pass this on to our next generation. If you have any question, don't hesitate to contact me, and I will see you next week. Thank you.